great that you're all here. The idea of these panels is, and this is going to happen now, and also at the end of the second part of today's seminar. The idea is that we collected some of the issues where we think some of the speakers might not perfectly agree or even disagree, and to give them an opportunity, to just discuss these points, but also to give the whole audience an opportunity to raise questions. So if there's anything unclear, or you disagree with something, or you want to express that you very much agree with something, feel free to raise your arm and tell us right now. The idea is that we prepared 3 issues. We are going just to talk about it, to start a discussion. Raise your arm whenever you hate what we are saying. Also indicate if you like it first. The first issue that we selected, maybe to become a little, just to warm up. The question is, are people becoming more social? And we've discussed that. Dirk was raising the point. We see all this cooperation today. This is a map from Couchsurfing, and each dot shows you a couch where you can sleep for free. And Dirk's interpretation was that this proves that people are more social today. Other people in the room argued, no, perhaps this is just a change in the institutions that we have today. So we have these new services. What is it? So who believes? No, let's ask it. Ryan, what's your opinion?
So my first thought when looking at it is that I see the technology leveraging and changing whom people can interact with. And so if you think 1,000 years ago, the social circle people had might be in the range of 150, and now with technology that can change substantially. So I'm not sure that they're becoming more or less social, it's just that their range of influence and with whom they can interact just becomes a much larger sphere.
I think it's not quite the emergence of new institutions that are fostering cooperation, but it's just different institutions. I mean, if you go back in time and you look at those developing societies, they often had, like religious groups or small social groups that also had these, maybe you can characterize this as risk sharing mechanisms and so on. So that's kind of how I see this.
Yeah, I find it a very difficult question. I wonder actually with Couchsurfing, is there a reputation platform? I never did that. Because I mean, part of that is probably reputation. You get so much by social influence, new media. I mean, eBay or hotels, you can have reputation and so on. So that makes it possible actually with new technology to spread the reputation. That's just a mechanism to enforce cooperation, and so it's not so much social. On the other hand, I'm just starting research on collaborations in science, and I'm also wondering whether, I mean, what you see is a trend towards more team research. More and more people are working together, teams become larger, it becomes the dominant way of publishing knowledge in science and social sciences in ways. I also wonder whether it becomes more important to be pro-social as a researcher, actually. Yeah, I also don't have an answer to that, but I'm just putting it here.
I do not have much to add to what the others said. I think first, when I think about going to another's home and sleeping there, then my experience is when I was young, that this was an experience that you experience in remote places. So it was not what you experienced in Zurich or in the neighborhood, but you experienced it in Greece or something like that. So I never made the experience, but I heard it from colleagues. And so I doubt a little bit that what we observe here on the left-hand side is really what that is based on increasing social preferences. I also think that it's definitely not the right method to look at these pictures. It's to make these conclusions, and it's also not the right way to talk just a story to draw these conclusions. So I think we really need to make observations. And my experience in the lab is that not that much changed over the last, let's say, 20 years. So I would say in the last 15, 20 years, not much changed. But it's nevertheless, it's of course difficult to judge that, because there is also experience and learning going on in the different labs. So I think over time we will experience more and learn more. So what we need really controlled situations to test.
Yeah, I do think that people become more social, but that this is related actually with the growth of new kinds of institutions. And I see it actually in an evolutionary context. So our world is becoming more and more complex as we go on networking it. It's more and more difficult for a single person, even a professor, to understand everything which is going on in the world. I think it's actually impossible. It's impossible to understand even how a single car is exactly constructed, or all these processes that are underlying our society and economy today have this level of complexity that it doesn't fit into one brain anymore. So as a consequence, we need to find new ways of creating the intelligence that allows us to manage this complexity, to cope with the situations that we're in. And this can only be collective intelligence. I mean, something that brings the intelligence of many people together. And that's why I was talking about network minds, and this can only happen with a social element in it, I would think. So you could also wonder, okay, how will biological evolution go on our Earth? So we became more and more intelligent species in a sense, but biological evolution is pretty slow, it seems. Cultural evolution is fast. In the United States and elsewhere, people are saying, okay, how can we as people evolve? And they're talking about transhumans and so on, and saying, okay, maybe we need to have brain expansions, and all these kind of things, and artificial senses are implanted into our bodies. I'm not sure whether this is the way we will evolve. I mean, there will also be this competition with artificial intelligence that is being grown now, and in about 10, 20 years, this artificial intelligence might outcompete humans. So, we will have competitors in a sense. And all of this, I think, creates a situation where we need to be more intelligent, but we create this intelligence by working together, for example, in larger research teams. And at the moment, we see information technologies grow that allows people to coordinate each other much better and to collaborate better, and this enables them to be more collaborative and more social in the sense. While before, often people were exploited, and I said this, homosocial is not somebody who's unconditionally cooperative. He's conditionally cooperative, so it depends very much on what happens in the environment, the experience that you do. And if you have institutions that avoid making bad experiences, then you get more cooperative in a sense. I mean, we do see that platforms like Wikipedia have grown, that people thought were not even possible. And there's a whole research field now about things like Wikipedia. Why do people spend their time on something where they get very little reward apparently? But they're doing it because it's good for something. And apparently they're not benefiting from from this themselves as much as we would think they would have to benefit in order to do such a thing. So mysterious things are happening here, and I think it has to do with the more social behavior.
Thank you, Dirk.
Before I would like to just ask first to. No, thank you. I don't want to. You said that over the last 20 years or 25 years, I think maybe like your first experiments were. When did you do your first experiments where you measured social preference? Like mid-late 80s, right?
No, late 90s.
90s?
Started late.
Okay. But since then, you think that for experiments that for you are more or less comparable in terms of setting, in terms of people, you think social preferences have stayed more or less stable, or observations are comparable over time, or?
I think there are a couple of games that are studied, so automated games since the 80s, and I think the results are more or less robust. Now the question is why, but I think that the automated game is anyhow a rather robust game, because really low offers are cheap to reject. I think so that's what's my observation, but that's very imprecise because it's just an impression, and perhaps with sophisticated methods we could find out more. I would like to comment on what you said. I think when we talk about are we becoming more social, and the question is what do we mean with social? I think what's definitely clear is that we have more interactions. And that's clear because there are many more opportunities how we can interact, and we have many more far interactions with people who are further away. I think what I'm particularly interested in is whether social preference changes, and I think many of the technologies actually allow much more to monitor each other, and that increases selfish incentives to work for reputation, and for that reason increases the selfish incentives to be seemingly pro-social or behave in a pro-social way, but for selfish motives.
Let's give Dirk a quick opportunity to react, and then we move on.
And it's also the observation of young people, what are their preferences, what is important for them. And for example, you're building this large nervous system. It could be done as a company, with the aim to make millions or even billions, like Facebook or Twitter, or to create it as a public good. And if I talk to the students who are involved in this, most of them don't seem to be interested in making a lot of money. On the contrary, they'd like to create a public good for everyone. So they have, it seems, different motivations from previous generations, and the whole making culture is built on sharing, open source, or take GitHub. It's so natural for young people today. You want it to be open source. You don't want it to keep it on your hard disk. You're proud of sharing.
But this must be a selection bias, right? I mean, someone who works in IT at an academic chair, working on a very big idea. I mean, that's someone who's more academically minded than someone who is money oriented. I mean, you'd never see him in your chair of sociology. Those guys already had Swiss Re insurance. So it'd be interesting to see whether these guys have changed. Perfect. I don't think there's evidence of that.
I'm going to begin by singing a song. It is the dawning of the age of Aquarius. The hippies all said that a long time ago. And you know what happened to my hippie friends? They drugged themselves out for about 8 years, and then they all went to law school. No, let me be serious. I think the major thing happening is what the sociologists said in the 1960s, which is called modernization theory, which is people turn from being more parochial to more cosmopolitan. In other words, more older forms of social organization where you were family and you were in your little community and you had no idea about a large cosmopolitan universe, and everybody who wasn't in your small community, you had to fear, more or less. You had to worry about, and you certainly didn't interact with unless you had community backing. What we have now is generations, or more than one generation, of people who are willing to cooperate with strangers and like it. And they do it for fun, and it's part of self-realization. One of my favorite experiments is Benedict Hermann-Cooney and Gechter showing that antisocial punishment is associated with a less cosmopolitan, open democracy, free speech, etc. Now, my interpretation of that, which I'm not sure is correct, and I talked to Ernst about this last night, but my interpretation is that people who are hurting others who cooperate are really hurting others who hurt them. They figure out that it's the cooperators who are punishing them, and it's retaliation. But it's also a form of maintaining your culture. If my culture is I only help and interact with people who are like me, my family, or my tribe, or my clan, and when someone tries to make me be cosmopolitan, I react by hurting them. So it's a clash of cultures there, but they're both pro-social. There's no change in sociality. It's become more cosmopolitan and generalized rather than clan and family based.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, when I heard things like, "Oh, the world changes every day faster than ever," then I'll think, "Oh, okay, it's a journalist talking," yeah? Because journalists always say that, and it's a bit provocative now. But sometimes I think if I read, for example, old books or something, and I recognize the world has always been changing, and sometimes even faster than today. And we live in, actually considered a long term, we live in very stable times now. My grandfather has witnessed 4 constitutions in Germany, for example, and I don't know what else. And like 100 years ago, big machines came up that also disrupted the job market totally. Just like you said in your presentation yesterday, many jobs will be done by computers in the near future. So I would also say we need a bit more of the story behind that. Why is the world changing faster than ever? Because on the demand side, actually, I think that many things are getting less complicated. I could trade stocks now here, sitting here, if I wanted. 20 years ago, it was impossible, right? And so it's not only the story of the world getting more complicated, but of the world getting much less complicated. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Okay, I think we should move to the next one. But as a summary, I think this is a wonderful research question, isn't it? So we see these changes, and the question is it because people have changed, or is it because people have developed institutions that allow them to cooperate more? This is a wonderful research question.
I'd like to add one important point. You have raised this issue whether it's a selection bias, whether it's just these computer freaks that basically like to share for free and so on. And in fact, our economy is also based on a selection bias because now it's run by economists, and we know that these are people who are driven very much by material interests in many cases. And so it also comes down to the question, will computer guys take over the way our society and our economy will be run? And it could very well happen, actually. I mean, there's this book called Code is Law. And if you look into what the Silicon Valley is doing, it's pretty much rewriting the rules of our economy and society.
But
I
they
think.
do it for
That means
money.
computer science, computer freaks will maybe playing the roles of defining our society and economy that previously economists have played.
So, do you believe that this whole movement of the of open source or all these little startups that are funded, are not driven by financial interests? These guys want to make money. It's not that they're social; they just want to make money. And all these companies now produce money. They're not. They don't have other regarding interests.
This is not open.
Okay, let's move to the next issue. This is taken from 2 slides. This is a slide from Dirk, this is a slide from Brian. And the question is, do we need a new theory for the Homo socialis? Dirk argued, let's throw away economics and develop a new...
I didn't say it like this.
Oh, brilliant. At least you said something, we need a paradigm change, which is about the same as throw it away. And you say that there are 2 distinct paradigms. One is the standard economics, and one is economics 2.0, which you also call socioeconomics. And this is focusing on other regarding preferences, whereas the other is focusing on self-regarding preferences. And then there was Brian, who basically said, no, self and other regarding preference, and self and other regarding behavior can be explained with the same models. The same model that captures all of this different behavior. So, what does the panel think?
I think it's an interesting and relevant question in what kind of situations social preferences are relevant. And I think it's clear they are relevant in a couple of situations. I think it's very difficult, for instance, to understand why there is voluntary unemployment, which is a crucial phenomenon in the market, and I think one element to explain that are social preferences. But we cannot explain where they are relevant if we do not have theories that use social preferences and investigate in what situations theoretical predictions, macro predictions actually differ between if we incorporate social preferences or not. So I think for me it's a clear yes, we need social preference, we need to understand in what situations they affect aggregate outcome and in which they don't. So I would say if we don't have a good explanation why social preference do not play a role, we should incorporate them, because there is a lot of evidence on the micro level, on the individual level, that they exist.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I said almost the same things, I guess. I mean, certainly we need social preference models. I mean, it's also not about just one model. I believe there is heterogeneity, like different types of pro-sociality can be important. But I also think there are different situations in which people act more selfish and other situations where people act more pro-social. And it's very important to find out in which situations one is the case, in which situation the other is the case. Situations at workplace, maybe one situation where people are more selfish, for instance, I don't know. And seek more, or are seemingly pro-social, but it's basically about reputation, for instance, and these kind of things. I mean, it's much harder to find that out in reality. I mean, in the lab, you can play with that and control for certain things like reputation formation. And in real situations, it's much harder. But that's kind of the challenge, I guess, to find out in which situation what matters.
So, I mean, I think the way social science develops, you have this big ongoing conversation between economics, sociology, psychology, anthropology. People are always, documenting insights on how people are behaving. And as in the first slide in the giving, economics is, I mean, you could say on the left-hand side, it's 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, or maybe to put it more favorably in this helping figure, it's more like 2.1, 2.2, 2.3. On the other hand, maybe this rational actor model, it's it's more like that's the 0.0. Like, what is economics? Are you defining economics as it's a self-regarding, that's the paradigm, or is economics simply a formal framework to understand human behavior? Maybe that's even taking it a step even further up from the rational active model. And if you think of economics as more or less formalization and mathematization, then I don't think it's really there's a standard model that's wrong that needs to be replaced, but simply we're just developing better understandings, better tools and methods to mathematize and better understand what are the assumptions driving explanations of various.
So pretty clearly I have a strong opinion on this. That slide on the right does tend to capture how I was thinking of this, would describe it. But I think to build on the points you guys were making, when do we see different preferences? When do we see different actors emerge? If we have a map like this, that gives us a place to start to look. So auctions or marketplaces tend to be at the 0, 0 point. We tend to see people being selfish and anticipating others are going to be the same. And that gives us predictive power. But we can imagine other institutions, other social contexts in which people's preferences may be shifted to be more pro-social, where they may anticipate the same from others, and that's a different part of the map. And then this also suggests dynamics. What sorts of forces move a person from this part of the map to this part of the map? And so to me, that's a very fruitful way to look at it. And to echo your point, yes, it's a generalized formal structure of trying to understand why people do what they do. And this, I think, we have such a thing. The challenge now is to sort of to put it on foundations that are more psychologically realistic and measurable.
I think we have to think about how people really behave, and I think when you talk about the auction, I think it's the institution that changes the behavior. So in the auction, if you would apply a social preference model to auctions, you probably would get the same results as the standard model. Now our reflex is to say, okay, in that case people behave selfishly. Actually they do not behave selfishly. Social preference just do not matter. And I think that's the crucial thing to think about. How can we model, or how can we create a stable model of human behavior that we can apply to all situations? And I think the model that incorporates social behavior is definitely the better model and creates more stable behavior than one that takes only selfish preferences into account. I do not doubt that there are situations in which people change their sociality, for instance, in interaction with different people, also how they have been treated in the past. But then we also have to think about whether we just didn't forget some of the elements that are actually relevant for the model.
Yeah, so it would be nice to see again the statistical distribution of Ryan's experiment, which showed that there was a clear peak in the selfish parameter range, and then there was kind of a gap, and then there was a majority of pro-social behavior, but a broad distribution. So there's a range of pro-sociality and of friendliness or other regardedness or fairness, whatever. And this is actually what my evolutionary model of the evolution of other regarding behavior shows. It also has this broad distribution. So this is not just 2 points in a parameter space, two sharp types. The Homo economicus is a sharp type, it's just 1 point in the parameter space, but Homo socialis is actually more to be considered as a distribution. Now, there are 2 important points to make. First of all, we need to understand both types, and that may need 2 different kinds of bodies of theory. Second of all, the institutions that we have seem to be very much tailored to the Homo economicus and a certain kind of market institutions. So why don't we build market institutions for the Homo socialis? There are many people today, who demand from their banks that they would offer them environmental friendlier investments or you know, you can buy a smartphone or clothes for a more or less cheap price, but people start to worry about the production conditions. So they want to have a socially more favorable production. And so why don't we come up with new institutions that would allow these people also to trade, to engage, to make profit, but in the way they want to do it. And I do think that eventually now new kinds of market institutions are growing with reputation systems and so on, but it's overdue. We have to try much harder, and I think this is going to transform our economy and will allow us to overcome perhaps the strategies of the comments that the home economicus cannot solve.
There are already many firms, brokerages, that cater to people who have special interests. If you're a Christian, you can have Christian investments. If you're green, excuse me, you can have green investments. You don't need anything for that. People come up and notice that people have a demand for something, and then they supply the demand, no problem. The people who do the supplying and figure out that other people want all these social homosocialis stuff, they are usually extremely driven, and they themselves are extremely not economicus, but power people. I mean, think of Steve Jobs, or no one in the industry I ever met has liked this person. Or Zuckerberg, who muscles everybody out of the way and produces an incredible product. And these people who produce these products, they're looking at what people want. And similarly with Nike or social production, you don't need a new economy for that. These people get burnt when they have hire third world firms that burn whose factories burn down. I don't see any new institution ever. I don't see any new institution other than the market and the state and local governments and families. Those are the institutions, and if there's a new one, you'll have to tell me what it is.
Reputation systems.
No, they're already reputation systems. They've always been part of the economy.
No, but there was no global reputation system. You knew what people were doing in your village or in your company, and we're not knowing what somebody in Asia or America is doing. And now you can engage with him, you would know beforehand what kind of person.
Right, but that's within the way things work. That's how the economy works. People realize that they're reputation systems, and if they're strong enough, then they can transact. It's not that people are getting more honest. I mean, go look around at the real thing happening with corruption is it used to be a good low-level thing. If you're poor, you can steal. Now, you can't even steal if you're poor. The people who steal are these firms in Kiev, and where all the computers people get together and they rob the bank. And you can't steal a car anymore in the United States. You can't steal a car. I mean, when I was a kid, what are you going to do? I don't know, let's go steal a car. You can't steal a car because they're all wired up, and you can't steal a cell phone anymore because it's got a code and this and that. So the technology is changing, but I don't see any new institution that you're talking about at all. I'm being provocative. I see that there are new opportunities for the same institutions, but there's no new institution. Anyway.
But is there perhaps a need for new institutions? Is this something that Dirk mentioned?
Well, I don't even know what that means until you show it to me. I mean, I never would have ever thought of Uber. I couldn't have thought of that.
And so Dirk,
But I can't think of a new
this
institution.
qualified money, for instance. So can you shortly summarize what you were talking about, Dirk?
Danny wanted to say something.
Well, one of the questions is the role of ethics. Yeah, and some people care about it, but if you are acting in a competitive market, then you have to be able to be better than others. And if you restrict your options, it's becoming increasingly more difficult to be better than others. That means that forces people often into a situation that they have to neglect their moral values, and basically ignore ethical issues because they're in this competitive situation. And that creates a race to the bottom and tragedies of the commons, many things. And we do see a lot of global instabilities that are caused by this dynamics. Now, I do see that there are entrepreneurs who don't want to play according to these rules, that don't accept any ethics, basically, or don't allow any ethics. So the question is, can we create markets that are productive and efficient, but allow people to exercise their ethics?
Their assets?
Ethics.
Let me just say, there is a movement in the United States called social entrepreneurship. And I've written about that, and there are people, and people come see me who are social entrepreneurs. They want to do good.
That's something that's
But they wanna
existed
do
in
well.
Europe for 150 years.
Right, there's nothing new, but well, it's gotten bigger, because at least in the US, it used to be, businesses make profit, and if you try to do anything else, forget about it, it's just a joke. But it isn't a joke at all. And one final point, this idea that if you have a competitive system, that ethics goes downhill, I think that is just false. We have scientific systems that are highly competitive. How do you get money? How do you publish? Is there corruption? Yes. Is there fraud? Is there plagiarism? Yes. But it works pretty well. And similarly, in medicine, in most countries, it's highly competitive. People make a lot of money, but you don't go to medical school and they tell you, now listen, everybody's out for himself. So when you advise a patient, just make the most money. Tell him he's got the disease that'll make you the most money, and prescribe the drugs that'll make you the most money, and send. No, it isn't what's happening. It is not what's happening. It's just not what's happening. There's a very small minority of people who do that, and there are people who fudge around the edges. Like in the U.S., there's huge differences in the rate of certain procedures between one state and another state, between one hospital and another. And that's becoming adjudicated now. But the idea, and it's also true of business, the idea that businessmen are all jerks and selfish sociopaths is such a lie. I know the left in Europe often believes that, like no one wants to go into business, because, I care about people, I'm a good person, I'm not one of these cutthroat guys that has a firm. Well, that's crap. If most businessmen are honest, they care about their ethics and their obligations and their self-dignity. And what has corrupted America has been homo economicus theory, so-called agency theory, where you go to business school and they tell you everybody's selfish. Well, of course, if you create a culture of selfishness, then people are going to behave selfishly. Not because people believe it's true so much as they believe you can't ever fight it. You can't be a whistleblower because we know in business that everybody's going to criticize you because just take what you can get. Well, that's changing too. There is an ethics to business, and there always has been. In countries where they don't have that ethic, they don't have real vibrant business cultures, and they don't do well. So I just don't believe any of that. I don't see any new institutions or any new need for institutions. It's just more of the same with new technologies.
So two small comments on this ongoing discussion, and then one that sort of returns to the slide. So, in some ways, I think we have had reputational mechanisms in a lot of different market and institutions going back like 100 years or so. If you look at the credit rating agencies of like various banks. I mean, so that's been there. So is it like a new, or is it just that you started to find other ways or other types of groups to play these games? And then on the computer guys who are somehow different than all the other econ types, caricature. Well, financial crisis, computer people who are trying to, optimize, like, it's still very, I mean, if you look at the computer science paradigm, I mean, all these algorithms on, like, what's big O, like optimal sorting and all that, I mean, there's still a optimization paradigm that's going on in a lot of what goes on in programming. Okay, so, and then sort of segue, sort of going back to this title slide, I was also thinking, so back to the comment about what is economics? Like, is it something that's simply this 1.0, or is it something about the rational actor model, or just kind of formalization more generally? So let me give like a comment from another sort of angle of social science that sort of I'm more familiar with, which is empirical analysis of large data sets, right? So distinguishing between correlation and causation is like a really big challenge in sort of any sort of science. So how would you define economics in the last like 30 or 40 years? Well, there have been methods where people develop like ways to distinguish causation from correlation when you can't run experiments, so natural experiments. So if you look at like Steve Levitt and Freakonomics, whatever you think of him or his work, I mean, he would say, well, I'm trying to show causal relationships when incentives could play a role, okay, like in crime, those kind of stuff. But then the next generation, again, is this 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, or is it still just the same thing? You have people like Emily Oster saying, let's develop causal relationships in public health. So we're going to use the same economics or natural experiment economics toolkit, and now we're going to look for causal relationships where people previously were just documenting correlations. It's the same toolkit. She would consider herself an economist and so on, but so that's what I'm kind of. Is it really like a either or is it just sort of more of the same? Like a little bit kind of like, but anyway.
Quick reaction, I hope, and then let's collect some.
Just wanted to mention and reply to her that in medicine we have something like an escola oath, right? So there is an established ethics. And the question is, do we need that also elsewhere? I don't want to answer this here. And there was another point that was just
Let me ask the audience, are there any questions about experiments, social preferences? Okay, there's one.
On the on the previous discussion about whether people are more social now or anything, I mean, we do know for a fact that people are more interconnected, right? More networked. So could it be just an illusion, right? So people may have been like that, just didn't know. They were too far away, right? So we now, and you usually see only good things. Bad things tend to be, I mean, on social networks, for example, okay, you have the things that reach the news, but then you see nice people and, oh, look at what that guy did in, I don't know, in Venezuela or whatever, right? So it may just be an illusion. So we think that people are being nicer. There are some kind of institutions or whatever, so people can express their nicety, but maybe they had always been there. What do you think?
Question for the panelists, right? That's the evolution panelist this afternoon with Herb and.
I'd like to point out a book by Steven Pinker called Our Better Angels. It's a fabulous book. It has not been criticized for its facts, but the main fact is that the degree of murder and violence in the world has gone down by an order of magnitude in the past 100 years. And the reason is the state. The state takes over and doesn't let people kill each other as much. So in that sense, it's the institution that changes the behavior and not the changes in people.
Heinrich.
I have a question for the panelists, and for all of them, in particular for Earth, which is related to one point we raised yesterday, and that is really to explain, revealed preferences in the lab. And when we go to richer lab experiments, repeated experiments, and when we look at explanations of real world phenomena, where almost everything is pseudo-repeated, or at least has a potential to be repeated, isn't the story that we contrast Homo economicus with Homo socialis just a cheap way of not being able to answer what Homo economicus would really do in the repeated scenario? In other words, isn't it orthogonal to this research to look at repeated games? I mean, this is just saying that I think again here this distinction between Homo socialis and Homo economicus is unclear, because Homo economicus, not in your research, but in a lot of the experimental research, is reduced to a stage game optimizer, and he's not considered to be forward-looking and things like that. So I think the fact that we've talked about reputation a lot already shows that.
I think, of course, in any model of social preferences, the own payoff is still part of the motive. So that's clear. And but I think when you think of reputation systems, then if you think of reputation systems in a finitely repeated game, then you need some strange guys in order for all the others to give up reputation. You need not too many of them, but you need them in these kind of games. So I think it could be that part of our social preferences have developed in repeated games, and we just, in order to reduce complexity, we apply them also to not repeated games like in the lab. So that's one possible interpretation. I wouldn't say that that's wrong. I think it's important to know whether we have really innate or not innate, whether we have robust, whether we have true social preferences. That's crucial, because I think there are many situations there are situations in which we really don't have to fear our reputation and nevertheless behave in a nice way, in particular if it's not too costly. So I think there are situations in which this exists, but I think it's also important in the active, because I think it's also part of the basis that we can build reputation systems.
Okay, in the interest of time, let me thank the 4 panelists, everybody who asked questions, who answered questions, and wish everybody a nice lunch. We'll be back at 2 o'clock. Thank you.